Thank you everyone to participate in this vegetable chat session. We will talk about potato today, and our speaker is Chris Long from Michigan State. And during this session, feel free to put your questions on the chat box. I will be the moderator and I will ask the questions to Chris throughout the presentation. Then I will pass it to you, Chris.
Thank you very much. Hey, good morning, everyone. I appreciate the opportunity to be here and just share a little bit with you about potatoes. I'm a potato extension specialist here at Michigan State University. I started in this position back in 2001 and really enjoy the collaborative relationship with our Michigan potato industry and also national industry partners in applying research to real-world agriculture. Today, if I can make my slides work again. There we go. So I thought I'd start off with just a general broad introduction of Michigan potato production and the industry that I'm most familiar with working with here in the state of Michigan. So some of you may produce less than 20 acres of potatoes. So I want to make sure that I'm sensitive to your type of production and the issues you face. I don't know that I'll be able to address issue-specific things for you per se. I'm happy to take questions, and we can really kind of see how some of these principles dovetail and work together. But with that being said, I'll just move forward here. So the Michigan potato industry, meaning growers that are producing 20 acres or more of potatoes, we project to produce somewhere between 48 and 50,000 acres annually. Nationally, we're ranked number 8 in overall production in relation to other state production volumes by acre. We do have a small seed potato industry in the state of Michigan, 2,500 acres of seed. Michigan is a net importer of potato seed, largely from the state of Wisconsin, some from Maine, Nebraska, and other surrounding states. But I would say of an area that could grow and expand in our Michigan industry would be in the seed potato production area. As I had mentioned earlier, primarily I'm focused on growers that produce 20 acres or more. In the state of Michigan currently, there's somewhere in the mid 50 some growers that produce 20 acres or more. And of those 50 some growers, 20% really produce about 90% of the total potato production in the state. So one thing we're known for in Michigan is our potato production, specifically for the chip potato processing industry. We work with all major chip processors, and that's where the majority of our potatoes end up, is processed. And so we work largely with round white potatoes that are specifically developed for that industry. We produce about 18 million hundredweight of potatoes. That means of that 20%, those growers that grow 20 acres or more, they each produce about 1.2 million hundredweight of potatoes. So we store about 14 million hundredweight. So that's kind of another one of our big claims to fame, is having the infrastructure to store potatoes for 4 to 9 months. So it takes quite a bit of infrastructure, as you can see pictured here in the lower right-hand corner of the slide. One of the storage facilities, each one of those large bins that you can see in the lower right-hand corner with the large open door stores about 40,000 hundredweight. So it just gives you an idea for this one facility how many potatoes are stored there. Probably one of the biggest challenges in our industry in the state of Michigan is tuber loss, and primarily related to 2 things. One is just dehydration or water loss, and then tuber pathogen breakdown. So if we could make advancements or find solutions for dehydration and pathogen breakdown of potatoes, we would really increase our profitability overall. So Michigan net farm gate value is somewhere in that $270 million range. So just to give everybody a general idea where potatoes are produced in the state, these are older slides, but I think nonetheless convey a very clear picture where potato production occurs in the state of Michigan. With the darker county there and the image on the left being the Montcalm County. There's actually three counties. Ionia to the south, Montcalm, and then north of that is Mecosta County. And 50% of all the potatoes produced in Michigan are produced in those three counties. Now, this being a little older image, the Bay County area, or the area really directly to the east or to the right of Montcalm, that has actually decreased since this slide was generated. And then the area to the south and west, down in the same county areas, has really increased. So then moving over to the image here on the right, it's looking at water withdrawal, right? And from this, you can see counties that are highlighted darker blue, and that darker blue indicates a higher volume of water withdrawal. And there's a very good correlation between potato production and being in counties where there's a high percentage of water withdrawal. So again, just regionally gives you a concept of where potato production occurs in the state. So based on that, just some
Chris, can I stop you?
Yeah, I was gonna just ask for questions. Any questions? Yep, go ahead.
I was wondering, I have two questions on the same thing. Could you, if you are not going to talk this later, could you briefly describe some major types of potatoes? You see most of these chipping processings to growing in Michigan. What are the major types? And another thing I want to ask, why those potatoes are concentrated in those areas in Michigan?
Sure, no, those are excellent questions. I'll start with the lower hanging fruit, which is probably your last question. So two things I think are major components is abundant water and friable soil types. So loose, sandy loam soils for tuber expansion or high organic matter soils typically provide the best ultimate tuber quality. So then to your first question about market classes in Michigan. So one thing we don't have a lot of emphasis on, or very little, Michigan potatoes go to French fry processing. There are some out of Delta County and up in the Upper Peninsula that will go into a McCain's plant in Wisconsin for French fry processing. But in general, that's a relatively minimal or small amount. So first and foremost would be round white potatoes, high specific gravity for chip processing. Second to that then would be the table russet market. And then third to that would be a yellow flesh Yukon Gold. And I say that kind of in parentheses. There's very little Yukon Golds produced nationally any longer in large commercial volumes. They're all typically either European type yellows or US bred with European type yellow potatoes. And then we have a small novelty market with the red skin or red skin yellow flesh, or even the blue fleshed potato. So those would be our major market classes. So
those ones produced for the fresh market, it's for local or it's for the entire region?
Well, typically Michigan, one of our real assets, if you will, is our position to the East Coast. So typically we don't ship many potatoes west of Michigan. Not that we never do. There are processing plants in Wisconsin or the table stock market to the west, but generally we are moving all of our potatoes south and east for either fresh consumption or chip processing. So our market location, our ability to deliver to the East is, where we can save on fuel miles, your carbon footprint, so on and so forth.
Thanks. Yeah.
Any other questions?
I haven't seen any question in the chat. I will stop you if I see. Oh, I think Matt have a question.
Yeah, please.
Chris, great to hear from you. Thank you so much. Just wondering, on that same vein of Wenjing's question, how has the so-called little potato market influenced any of what you're seeing in terms of production for either chip or fresh? And in other words, an emphasis on smaller potatoes. And little potatoes obviously trademarked, right? And there's a huge volume of them going out. I'm not sure if any of them are being grown in Michigan, or if the overall emphasis on smaller potatoes has influenced anything about what you or the folks you work with are doing.
Yeah, Matt, good question. And I think it's more philosophical and market tension driven, right? So little potatoes ended up over in Wisconsin. And then you have Grimway and Tasteful Selections out in Bakersfield, California, right? That are primarily driving that baby potato market. And there have been some, at least two Michigan growers that I know of that have dabbled in that market. But literally it requires a second harvester, like one where the harvest chain pitch is tighter so the tubers don't fall through. It requires a different set of varieties. So it's difficult, if you will. You're producing like A-grade potatoes, 1 7/8 to 3 1/4, and you have this market class you're trying to hit. But then you're selling your off-size potatoes, your small potatoes, to little potatoes, or you never freight them all the way to California, right? But they're more of a byproduct for you, right? And then that changes from year to year, and you're not really growing potatoes for that market consistently. And so then if you change your mindset and say, I'm just going to focus on little potato production, and then the market tension and fluctuation in that, it creates some, it can be an unstable market or lack of consistency on known economic value for you as an organization, right? So you have to be all in or not, I think, in that market. So I don't know how accurate all my comments are, but there's just a lot of market tension there.
Yeah.
And so
still need for larger. I was just wondering if the chip stock has even if that has affected the ideal chip stock potato size, especially given the rise in snack bags instead of larger bags.
For sure. So the trend is there are more 1 ounce potato bags sold in the large family bags, requiring smaller profile potatoes. So yeah, that truly is a tension in the chip manufacturing industry, is developing and releasing varieties that have a smaller tuber size profile, or encouraging our growers to produce potatoes that are smaller in size profile to fit in those smaller bags. So I could go into a segue, talking with commercial processors and fitting larger potatoes, which make larger potato chips, into small bags. Just doesn't work. It clogs up packing machines. And so, there is an intentional grading. There's an intentional grading of raw product, but then an intentional development of varieties that have a smaller tuber size profile for that very market. Now, has that been driven by the little potato company? I don't know that you can draw that correlation, other than to say, I think our trend nationally is just for that smaller consumer size package.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, happy to wax and wane about those things with you. But I think market tension is largely the driver there. So So I was going to move on, just talk a little bit about the mechanical planting process, at least again for the growers that I work with. Typically, they're planting, 4, 6, 8, or 12 row planters. Some have 10 row planters, but this is a little bit about what that mechanical planting operation looks like with some of the folks I work with here. So this is a 12 row Harrison pick planter. You can see the vegetative plant parts or cut potatoes that have been supervised and treated, loading into the planter, headed out to plant. And so I think some of the
Chris, can I stop ask a question on the last slide?
yeah, well, anytime.
Yeah, great. So is that when growers receive the potatoes, they need to the seed potatoes, they need to cut it first before planting, right? Is that one step thing here?
Yeah, well, there's no clear straight answer, right? Some potato producer, especially the European model, is planting whole potato seed. So you're planting single drop uncut seed, because again, we could segue off into apical dominance and then needing to plant potatoes closer together to get your stem numbers per acre. So another whole conversation. But typically, growers are buying seed from a seed grower that fits a size profile parameter, in that they are mechanically cutting those in their each individual operations with a large, mechanical tuber cutter. And then they are providing good wound healing, proper humidity, storage temperature to get that suberin and lignin layer to form. And then they would treat those tubers either on the planter, like you see happening here with the bulk tanks, or they're treating it at the time of seed cutting with insecticide, fungicide that'll go to the field. So there's both things happening. Some growers are asking for their seed grower to strip off the undersides, and they're just going to plant Bs. Others are planting A-size tubers, which then they cut prior to planting, if I made that clear. So
Yeah.
not one size fits all. It's done a couple different ways, but in this case, these potatoes have been mechanically cut and suberized. But there are physiological considerations. So if you're thinking about planting all whole seed or all cut seed, your in-row spacing, some of the physiological changes that are happening in the tubers affecting stem number production, which is going to affect tuber set, which then needs to dictate your in-row spacing. So those are some considerations. And I'll continue on my soapbox. Something that you need to understand is a buyer of potato seed, it has a physiological signature, meaning the year that it was produced in 2025, say, for instance, it was grown under a certain physiological environment, therefore giving it a certain physiological temperature signature, which then, if you have juvenile seed or physiologically old seed, is ultimately going to influence what in-row spacing you should plant at in your plant stem population per acre. But unfortunately, I think it's very common practice for our industry to say, oh, I always plant this given variety at this given in-row spacing. And that's an easy, no-brainer approach. But for instance, Snowdens, which typically are planted at 13-inch in-row spacing, or 12 to 13 in-row. But if they're physiologically juvenile seed, I would encourage those being planted maybe more to 10-inch in-row spacing, versus if that seed is physiologically old, then, again, that 13-inch in-row spacing is probably appropriate because of the number of stems, which is influenced by apical dominance. So another whole tangent, I apologize, but I can get off in the weeds in lots of different ways, but just something else to consider when you're thinking about seed physiology.
That's great. But Chris, is tomato growers, they have the information of the condition of the seeds?
It's obtainable, whether they intentionally choose to obtain it and understand not only the physiological age of the seed in the field, but the temperature that the seed was stored under. The tools are there, whether they're agronomists or intentional about thinking that out. is something that we're always challenging and encouraging them to do. So my point is, know the physiological age of the seed you're planting. That would be the take-home message. Okay, so moving on, I guess I felt like to try to segue this concept of farm marketers and home potato producers versus large commercial potatoes production. Well, just I think a very good overlap in conversation is this concept of physiological age and understanding the metabolic machine and the physiological machine and some of those processes that are going on, because ultimately, no matter how much potatoes, whether you're planting a 100-foot row or 10,000 acres, quality at the end of the day is your end goal, right? Tuber quality, deliverability, marketability, and that's largely influenced by environment, right? So we're going to dive into that together here a little bit, maybe in a little too much detail, but I'll do my best to move us along in the conversation. The point of this slide really is just reiterating the fact potatoes are amazing photosynthetic machine, right? That generates serious carbohydrates that can feed a population, and it happens relatively quickly, right? In here, I've just have depicted a planting date of May 2nd, and really by the end of June, you've got a very strong, robust plant that's beginning to tuberize and set daughter tubers, right? So again, just the focus on this photosynthetic machine here, and then just kind of leading us into this conversation of just that, right? And what's happening, recognizing, I don't know if it's a buzzword, but metabolic function that's going on, right, in this plant system, in carbohydrate production and the balance of that. And so I have a couple images here to kind of talk about that, right? So we recognize photosynthesis is happening. The potato, under ideal growing conditions, is producing extra carbohydrates, simple sugars, translocating that down to tubers. And I mean, that's what we're after, right? We're marketing these tubers, but that can be negatively impacted by a number of things, right? So, but again, conceptually understanding there's metabolic function happening here, and we want to encourage, as potato producers, this process to happen smoothly and the highest level of performance possible, right? Well, there are things that can disrupt that or rain on our parade or cause us difficulty, right? So as you can see, the circle, the oval that says sugars, we want to move through normal tuber growth to produce a starch, right? Stable carbohydrates. And that happens under cool nighttime temperatures. And we're going to talk more about that. When I say cool nighttime temperatures, I'm talking about ambient air temperatures below 65 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, I have this word reconditioning here. That's something more that would occur in storage if the tubers have a high sugar content, but we can talk about that a little bit later in the presentation. Now, what we don't want to happen, or what we want to mitigate from happening, is the movement of starch, which we've accumulated in the tubers, back to simple sugars to manage stress, to manage tuber injury or plant canopy injury, or to fight off disease, right? So again, we want this to be a translocation of simple sugars down to a stable form of carbohydrate energy, which is starch, because that's what we're all selling here at the end of the day, right? So again, conceptually, just understanding this process. So how do I, as a gardener, as a 5-acre grower, or as a 10,000-acre grower, how am I mindful of this process? So recognizing the time frame that's going on here, right, from planting and sprout emergence to tuber initiation, then ultimately to tuber bulking and then maturation. There's really a period here, and I'm using Dr. Dong's cartoon here, but that the potato plants are most vulnerable or susceptible to stress, right? And we're going to talk a little bit more about types of stress. But really, once you're in that tuber initiation phase where you've got stolons and the stolons are hooking or have that primordial leaf, initiating tubers, really up to that what I would call sort of a mid-bulking phase, the potato plant, the tubers are most susceptible to these stresses. And so conceptually, you need to keep that in mind. And when are these stress events happening relative to when you planted? We'll get into more of these concepts and try to tie them all together as we go. At the university, we love triangles, and we love to use the triangle for different ways to depict interaction. And ultimately, I think we're all interested in potato tuber quality or producing a phenotype that's desirable, right? So this triangular relationship between G for genetics, the environment, and tuber quality or the phenotype, right? So genetics plays a huge piece of that. And then ultimately, then environment, right? And then how can we as growers best control those environmental factors to play with genetics to give us tuber quality. So just focusing on genetics a little bit, there's a lot here, not just in this slide, but genetics for each market that you're trying to meet. I'm happy to discuss that in broad terms and then point you to experts maybe that could address specific questions. But you as a producer, what market are you trying to deliver potatoes to? And what agronomic characteristics are important, right? Is it high tuber setting, small tuber size, smooth skinned potatoes for the little potato market? Or again, is it uniform round white potatoes for chip processing that some external defects aren't as important, but the internal raw product quality, especially the chemical quality or the sugar quality, is extremely important. So again, just understanding your market class, what genetics are going to deliver that quality, understanding maturity, bulking rate, specific gravity, right? There's a bulking rate of the plant genetically, but there's also a period of time. Some varieties bulk later in the season when they're more mature, and others start earlier. It's just genetic difference there. Understanding dormancy, physiological dormancy. Are you going to store these, ship these fresh out of the field? Just some things to be mindful of. Obviously, disease tolerance, whether it be foliar tolerance, tuber tolerance. We really need to talk about bruise susceptibility. There's different types of bruise. We refer to impact bruise or black spot bruising versus pressure bruising, which typically occurs in storage environments. And different varieties have different tolerances or resistances to that. But then environment influences that wildly, and we just need to understand that well. And then skin set and wound healing. Very interesting area in and of itself. We get all excited about chipping potatoes that have a slow metabolic metabolism that converts starch to simple sugar slowly, which helps us have a nice white potato. But sometimes those potato varieties are the poorest wound healers. Why? Well, they convert starch back to simple sugar to wound heal themselves slowly. Well, we like that on one aspect, but we dislike that on the other when we're trying to get these potatoes to ward off diseases or wound heal themselves. So there's always these trade-offs and things that we battle. So pictures here, right? You can see early tuber initiation, or excuse me, early tuber bulking here, and just some pretty pictures of potatoes. All right, any questions with that? I want to get into move out of the genetics conversation, which I'm happy to take questions, and really talk about environmental stress.
Chris, I want to clarify, understand that. So you described that starch and sugar. So that is a consistent shift between those two chemicals depending on the environment while the tubers start to grow. Is that correct?
Yeah, and I will talk more about it as we go, but right, we want the potato plant to be producing high rate of simple sugar, translocating that down and making these longer carbon chain, stable starch. But when the potato's under stress, high nighttime temperatures or hail damage or other things, abiotic or biotic stresses that occur, those potato plants need to take that starch, reconvert it back to simple sugar to ward off or solve the physiological issue that they're facing, right? Or if it's a higher nighttime temperature, they're respiring harder at night, right? Their respiration rate is higher, so they need more energy. But what's happening at night? They're not photosynthesizing. So under those high nighttime temperatures, they have to get energy from somewhere. And where do they get it? From the tubers. And we don't want that to happen, right? So how do we mitigate high nighttime temperatures, which is a major challenge? But we can get into some of that sugar conversion stuff a little bit more, unless there's other specific questions. So,
I did not see more questions at this point. Guess we'll continue.
there's a lot here, right? So I probably turned it in an hour talk into 2 hours here, but and we can stop at any time too when we're running out of time. But abiotic and biotic stresses, right? So abiotic being temperature and moisture, biotic insects, pathogens. Just again, just the mindfulness of the different types. And then again, I want to refocus us on it's not a matter of do we have them, but when do they occur in this physiological developmental process? Point being, if they happen from the time I plant to when the plant's very juvenile, and just not even touching within the row, like potatoes are almost bulletproof in a sense. I mean, largely you can throw herbicides at them. You can't kill them, right? It's very difficult because of that carbohydrate sink that they're living off of. But you get past that, then they become much more vulnerable to these stresses. And then again, later, well, the crop's already made, the tubers are there. So you get hail very late, or pathogens come in late. Well, your crop's largely made, right? So again, what stresses am I having and when is it happening during the physiological development of my crop? Because that'll influence what kind of defects you have. So these are, again, just the overall mindfulness and awareness. All right, so just
Chris, can I stop you here? Can we go back to the last picture here? I was wondering at the beginning when you talk about the planting in beginning of May, I assuming at that time Michigan still have frost, haven't passed the last frost date. Is that at the beginning the plant is not very susceptible to those environmental stress?
Yeah, so planting date, right? And obviously, planting date in Michigan from southern Michigan can be probably even as early as early April up through the 1st of June. And the earlier you plant, the longer that tuber sits in the soil. Again, it takes thermal units to get that seed piece to develop and move. And that can help you avoid the frost, right, from emerging and getting frosted off. But it also can expose that tuber seed piece and that plant to more soil-borne pathogens too. So there's definitely a yin and yang there. But for our larger commercial growers, like they have to get started because they have 8,000 acres of potatoes to plant. So if they don't start April 1, they're not going to get done by June 1, right? So there's just a lot at play. I don't know if there's any one direct answer to your question. Florida experienced a big freeze that killed off a bunch of potatoes, right? So anyway, yeah, I could probably.
That is a risk the farmers take if they plant early. Yeah.
It's a risk the farmers take. And at some level, a light frost, the crop, although it will be set back, will grow out of it. So, yeah, again, it's a production tension that the grower is managing. It's hard to do the ideal thing on every acre based on the volume of production.
Yeah, I understand. Is Matt have a question? I see you on mute.
No, I was enjoying this conversation. I am enjoying this conversation and this question, the question about the developmental stage and susceptibility, Chris, to frost. And I'm trying to recall a circumstance when a significant amount of frost damage occurred kind of in a northern tier state like Michigan, New York, Wisconsin, Maine. I'm I'm sure there have been some, but Wenjing, I understand it. There's so much protection that's coming from the soil to begin with, and then there's like a physiological push very strong at that point with that reserve in the seed, more than one growing point. So you might lose a stem, but not the entire plant, right? So it could affect it in that way. But anyway, really appreciate your comments, Chris.
No, Matt, it's fun to just yin and yang about it because I mean it probably influences ultimate stem numbers, and again, stem numbers drive typically tuber set per plant. So maybe a frosted crop is going to ultimately give you a crop that has a higher stem number per acre, but likely smaller tubers per acre. So you might not get your yield, but you'll get more numbers. There's just, there's a lot of physiological things going on. I don't necessarily have all the research data to prove exact things, but just general concepts, I guess. But
Yeah,
we do.
there's a resilience in the crop that others lack, actually, perhaps. Single stemmed crops that we work so hard to protect.
Good point. Yep. Yep. So I was just trying to give the audience or the group, that sense of abiotic stress versus biotic here. I think it's super intuitive for everyone. But, there's as many physiological disorders as there are things that are caused by biotic stresses, right? Disease pathogens, insects. So here you can see example of heat necrosis and then the hail damage. So I won't come back and show late blight again, but here's an example of late blight, verticillium dallii, the early dye complex, really shutting down the photosynthetic machine, right? And we'll talk about, so what happens when a biotic stress shuts down your photosynthetic machine and your tubers are in mid-bulking. Well, we can talk about it now, but later I talk a little bit about those tubers have a higher rate of simple sugars. Well, if you harvest them and try to chip process them, you're probably not going to have the best chip quality. Well, how do you manage tubers that have been, in a field with high early dye pressure, the photosynthetic machine has been shut down, but you have very juvenile tubers? It just sets you up for all kinds of interesting physiological discussions. So just moving on here, biotic stresses, right? I just kind of emphasize picture of Alternaria solani, early blight, Alternaria alternata, the brown leaf spot. Those are really some of our major foliar challenges. I mean, we have botrytis and gray mold and different things. Late blight seems to be fairly under control, but we have instances where late blight's a problem as well. Rhizoctonia, I thought this was a really neat picture in the sense on the tuber, you have the resting stage with that black scurf. You have the Rhizoctonia canker or the stem girdling, which really just wrecks your crop. And then the white powdery fuzz, the mating stage of Rhizoctonia solani, really all kind of pictured here in this one image. I thought was really nice. Obviously in Michigan, one of our bigger challenges, especially for the table stock or ware potato market, where appearance is so critical, is the presence of Streptomyces species, Streptomyces scabies, Acidoscabies, and then in some regions of Michigan, the Spongospora subterranea or the powdery scab, and you can see the differences here. But there are many more, black dot, silver scurf, to just name a couple others. And then the insect thing. So I'll say I'm not an entomologist or a pathologist, so I'd be happy to point you in the direction of somebody that knows more about these life cycles of these different pests, but happy to engage with you about them. But I just threw up, here 5. I thought more major pests that I feel like I deal with in my trials and potato research, being it the Colorado potato beetle, aphid species, flea beetles, tardive plant bugs, and our leaf hoppers. So the chewing, rasping, sucking insects, and the different issues that they bring about. So I wanted to move on and talk more about abiotic stress. Are there any questions that I might address about insects or pathogens? Or I move on?
Um, I didn't see questions. But Chris, I was wondering, since you work so much with the growers, is there any particular insects disease problems is getting worse recent years? Like I don't know any of them, but potential resistant to fungicide, all those sort of things. Like I was wondering if some growers already growing potatoes, they might want to get updated information on insect disease and what the Michigan growers are currently deal with major issues too.
Yeah, just so a quick litmus from my perspective, and again, this is just my perspective. I, obviously encourage you to connect with us, Dr. Zendre, right? Our vegetable entomologist. I would say probably one of the growing issues that we're facing as a potato industry is in our seed potato segment, seed potato industry, in the vectoring of potaviruses, specifically PVY and the different strains of PVY. So vectoring insects of PVY are really creating a lot of havoc for our potato seed industry. So without going into a lot more detail, I would say for sure that disease. So as far as pathogens go, I don't know that I can call out any one in particular. Obviously, early blight here, I point out, seems to be, a major problem for us. But in the table industry, I would easily go to the silver scurf and black dot, Menthosporium, the Colicotricum, really not having great tools to manage blemish diseases on the potatoes. But yeah.
Chris, there's a question from Dennis. Are you seeing any Colorado potato beetle resistance issues developing to new nicks?
Yeah. My understanding, and again, Sophia would be the expert on this, that there is like this slow crescendo or potential building resistance. I don't think that the resistance is to a point that we've had like control collapse. I don't know if those are the right words, but I would say to the neonics that the beetles are more resistant to them than they used to be, right? Meaning higher rates, more upsprays more often. So yeah, I think that's naturally building the population. I don't think we've lost control, but you can see issues on the horizon coming. But I think we've been very fortunate to have these chemistries for as long as we have. So I think you as educators and the research faculty have really worked to try to keep these tools around as long as possible. And I think neonics are an example of that, right? It wasn't 1 or 2 years, but there's decades that this product has been effective and personally remains effective. But I would say yes, there's building resistance. So it's interesting in Europe, I've chatted with some of my European colleagues. They have a resurgence of potato leaf roll virus. And I primarily equate that to the fact that they banned use of neonics, right? So there's just so many tensions around these topics. And, is there any one right answer? I mean, there's just social consequences in the choices we make one way or the other, right? At some level. Anyway, getting philosophical again. Hey, one of the things I'm super interested in, and again, is this whole physiology thing. And again, having some awareness of when abiotic stress occurs in relation to the physiological development of our crop, right? And I think one of the simplest measures is growing degree days. And I've been trained, and I'm not saying it's the right way, but is using base 40 numbers, right? different crops. You could use base 38 or for corn, warmer, makes sense, right? But for potatoes, we've used this base 40 number. For central Michigan, an ideal thermal signature is around 3,300 to 3,500 growing degree days on average. Now, if you're less than that, you understand you have a juvenile crop. If you're older than that, you have a physiologically old crop. That's really going to influence the storability, the senescence of your crop as it breaks dormancy and wants to sprout again, right? So understanding its thermal signature. I pointed out earlier, high nighttime temperatures are probably one of the most deleterious things for potato production. And in Indiana, southern Michigan, this is like in southern Michigan, northern Indiana, that high nighttime temperature can be very detrimental in driving physiological defects. So days that have high growing degree days over 35 we consider stressful. And this might be a little bit on the sensitive side, maybe a quarter inch of evapotranspiration, but surely up around a half inch of ET on a daily basis. That's a lot of wind and heat and stress on that crop. But again, it's not about having these events. It's when do these events happen, and are they happening during those critical physiological developmental stages? So back in the day, I worked with the EnviroWeather group and created this EnviroWeather heat stress tool. And for me, being very visual, it allows me to put in some critical physiological dates. So some of the vertical green lines are these key physiological events, right? You can see on the y-axis, we have cumulative growing degree days, and on the x-axis, we have time. And then we have all these color lines that appear at the bottom. Well, these are stress events, right, that occur. And so what we want to be mindful of by using this tool is, when did I plant my crop? When did it emerge? And when is it beginning to go through these particular physiological events? Tuber initiation, early tuber bulking, mid-tuber bulking. And then when is EnviroWeather telling me I'm experiencing stress events over the physiological thresholds that I've put in to this model? In here, you can see this model is telling me, Chris, your crop experienced a series of high nighttime temperatures, a series of high daytime temperatures, and some higher ET values soon after early tuber bulking. Okay, so that begins to then tell me that my tubers during that time period potentially are going to have some negative physiological defects that I'm going to have to manage as a grower, as a storage manager. So this is really a tool for you as a grower to help get your mind around when that heat stress is occurring. And then also less predictable, right? This has a small prediction function to it that I can know heat stress is coming, but it lets you go back and see, you know what, this particular variety, maybe I should plant it a little bit later, a little bit earlier, because I know in my geographic region, I experience environmental stress typically from July 1 to July 15. So how do I avoid that? How do I avoid having my crop be in this critical stage at that higher environmental stress time? So again, this isn't like a magic tool. It's going to fix your problems. It's just to help create awareness and understanding of abiotic stress against your given crop developmental time. Any questions about this tool or how it might be used?
Chris, I just want to make sure I understand. Is that the most success period for the abiotic stress? Is there early bucking period?
Again, I guess I tried to point out in my earlier slides, anything from like tuber initiation on to like mid bulking is probably the critical time points that abiotic stress could negatively impact your crop. So then this tool should tell you, hey, you either had it or it's coming, because again, it has like a 5 or 7 day predictive function. Then your mindset as a grower should go, what am I going to do to mitigate that? Well, irrigation is one of your major tools that you can use to cool your soil down, to keep your foliage less stressed potentially. So I don't have a lot of great data supporting like calcium nitrate applications, but there is some anecdotal information that calcium nitrate applications days ahead of stressful events can potentially be of value. But again, recognizing, do I have mitigation tools? How do I employ those ahead of stress events that are happening during critical growth and development stages of my crop?
Got it. I see Matt, have you raised your hand? You have a question?
Chris, I was going to ask if direct experience would lead you to think that there's anything to the canopy size, or the canopy size, or I'm sorry, the typical days to maturity of individual varieties has any effect on susceptibility to high temperature stress. We have some varieties that appear to have a larger canopy. They may, you talk about the photosynthetic machine, some have bigger canopies, but they don't necessarily produce a yield that's, 25% higher than a variety that has a relatively smaller canopy, as an example, or varieties that might take 110 days to mature and others are there in 90 to 95. And is there any interplay between that and those same varieties being planted at the same time and going through the stress in this window that you're talking about that would matter?
Yeah, Matt, I think these are you're right on, and they're things you very much should consider based on your geographic region of production, and when you're predicting that severe typical high nighttime temperatures to occur. Did you plant an earlier growing variety earlier or later to so you're right on. I don't know if you and I are on the same page, but getting an early big canopy up and giving shade to the soil underneath it for the tuber set to occur more in a cooler environment, I think is important. So early fertility, it's going to help you build an early canopy. To me, has some intrinsic value in this case.
Chris, there are two questions in the chat. Dennis is asking, are hot nights more stressful, impactful than hot days, or does that matter?
Yeah, it matters. Potatoes can take 100-degree days, right? For the most part. The humidity is another question, but 100-degree nights, create a lot more physiological stress than 100-degree days. Yeah.
And Charlie's asking, some smaller growers are interested in dry land production, and we generally have heavier soil at his place. Any otherwise for those growers for mitigating stress?
Yeah. Well, Charlie, I mean, I'm not an expert and I don't have it all figured out, right? So to me, it's, if you're interested in trying potatoes, you start small, you try to evaluate a number of genotypes or different varieties, and you do your research, right? Trying to find varieties that seem to have reported durability. But yeah, you're going to have some unique challenges in heavier soil and dry land potatoes, right? Because you're taking away a great mitigation tool in irrigation to reduce environmental stress, right? So I don't know if I can address that question anymore, any better, Matt. Anybody else? I'm like open for other people.
I was going to just, if it would be appropriate, I was going to just drop a link into the chat. Chris and others.
Go ahead, Matt.
OSU, in concert with other potato breeding programs, runs variety evaluations every year and has done so for many years. And it's all dry land. Excuse me. So we have a long history of reporting on this, and I'll drop a link in the chat. So
Great.
Thanks, Matt.
Yeah. And Chris, you mentioned using irrigation is a great tool. Does that mean you irrigate at night? how that affect the disease pressure?
No, that's a fair question and something that we all need to be mindful of, right? So,
But actually growers do that. They use irrigation at night to mitigate the stress when they have to.
correct. Yeah. There's so many things involved in this too, right? We're from my perspective, we're talking 120-acre fields to put a 3/4 of an inch of water on 120-acre field in a 24-hour period during the daylight is impossible, right? So you just have these mechanical constraints too, right? So again, is it the right thing to do? I think, logic would say, yeah, it'd be better to irrigate early in the morning, let your crop dry out, so on and so forth. But there's so many other constraints in production that causes us to not always do the best thing every time.
Understand. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Everybody good? Matt, I appreciate you being a resource. It's good to reconnect with you. I know we've had some interaction over time, but Ohio State Buckeyes are always in my heart.
Super glad to be hearing from you, Chris. Thank you.
No, thanks for participating. I hope, it's a good interactive opportunity. So yeah, conceptually, in my mind, I've got on the y-axis here physiological juvenility, physical maturity of tubers from young to old. The x-axis is kind of that sugar content concept. And ultimately, as producers, we want to get ourselves from the starting point over to the green quadrant, right? And whether this is a perfect or exact depiction of all examples or all reality, I don't know. But conceptually, I'm trying to get our mindset to, we don't want juvenile potatoes, physiologically young potatoes that have high sugars, nor do we want physiologically old potatoes that have high sugars, right? Or physiologically young potatoes that have very low simple sugar. So it's just this concept of how we're trying to move our potatoes physiologically, and I use the word chemically or sugar content wise, to this sweet, happy place. Okay. So take it for that, if you will, that slide. Again, conceptually, sometime in that early mid bulking area, we're trying to encourage a crop to in the upper line graph here with the tan and blue line, looking at sugar concentration on the left y-axis in solids, or more of that stable carbohydrate form on the right. You can see the inverse relationship. I think intuitively it makes sense to us that our tubers are building solids, and at some point our free simple sugar concentration should decline to a point we reach senescence or maturity. Again, I'm not talking about hard cold exacts here. I'm talking about generalities and processes. But recognizing at senescence, to understand physical and chemical maturity, you reach a point where you've maximized your solids and you've gotten as low as you're going to on sugars, but you actually see a little reversion there, right? And to me, that's the crop reaching a point it needs to take some of that stored carbohydrate to set skin, right? That takes energy. And where does that come from? From your carbohydrate sink. We all know, right? Potatoes are largely water. Water is critical for potato production. 20% dry matter. That's ultimately what we're selling, especially in the processing side of the industry. And there's a couple different types of starch right here with the amylose and the amylopectin. And then, potatoes are an excellent source of high quality vegetable protein. And at Michigan State, we're working on higher protein potatoes for that very market. So just some waxing and waning there. I don't want to get bogged down in these slides because of the time we have. We're already at an hour here. but there are tools, right, where we use our Yellow Springs instrument to measure sucrose and glucose levels, and just the simple act of measuring specific gravity can help us better understand the chemical maturity of our potatoes, right? So here I've got an August 19th date, September 3rd date. The more pre-harvest samples you take, you get a better concept of the chemical maturity in relation to its physical maturity, the health of the canopy, right? So I show some ideal numbers here. Again, I'm going to try to speed through these. This is the YSI. These are numbers here that are showing building solids and higher simple sugars. The glucose is higher, sucrose is higher. And the canopy rating tells us that the canopy's juvenile, right? Okay, Chris, well, you've shown an example of mature potatoes chemically, immature potatoes chemically. But what we're really trying to avoid as potato producers is when we get this kind of in between, right? And unfortunately, hail damage or verticillium dallii or other foliar biotic stresses can remove our photosynthetic machine and leave us at a place where we have a high simple sugar concentration, right? And you have these tools that can help you understand that from a processing industry side, and it really affects the marketability of these potatoes. So again, back to this little quadrant idea. If we have potatoes that appear physiologically old, meaning they've lost their photosynthetic machine, but the sugar content is still rather high because they didn't go to full maturity, that canopy was shut down quickly from these different pathogens, then you've got some decisions to make as a producer, right? Thinking about alternate markets, how that affects your the storability of this crop, or if you do store it, the need to go into a reconditioning phase where you're trying to maintain a higher physiological respiration rate in storage, burning off simple sugars to get to a cleaner, whiter chip that's going to chip process well. So again, I don't have a lot of time to go into all the nuances and details of that, but yeah, we're in an hour here.
Um,
I'm happy to go
Chris,
on.
as long as you you are fine, continue. We are fine. I think anyone wants to leave, feel free. Yeah.
Okay. Respect people jumping off. I'm sorry, this is going to turn into a two hour lecture here, but
No, we enjoy listen.
well, it's fun to interact with professionals and just have some fun in dialogue. So again,
But actually, Chris, I can stop you a little bit. The last slides you mentioned alter market. What does that mean? Like the farmers have the options to change where they want to go with their market on the potatoes?
well, not in make a profit, no, but I mean, I think as a grower, as an industry, right? You've got your number one A market where you're going to make money, right? Pay your bills, pay your family. But at the end of the day, if all of a sudden you have a field that's got early die, it shuts your crop down, and you've got a smaller yield, smaller tubers that have high simple sugars, well, what are you going to do with those? You're going to send those to Campbell's soup, right? Or are you going to send those to starch processing? Or are you going to say, you know what, I'm going to take a risk on these. I'm going to put them in storage. I'm going to store them at 54 degrees. It's going to keep that metabolic clock running, respiration rate higher to try to burn off those simple sugars and then send them to my A market. But recognizing I'm putting more electricity and storage energy and cost into a crop that I don't know that's worth it, right? So again, you're managing market demands and the cost of those potatoes and the return on investment. So does that help?
Yeah.
There's a lot of rabbit holes there. Yeah, but yeah.
So how farmers know that? Like I guess if they have a hail, they know their potatoes won't be good. Or is there a specific measurement that can tell them where they are and they can take actions?
Yeah, so I guess that's really why I'm encouraging the industry to use tools like this, like Yellow Springs instrument. These samples, it's about $100 a sample. And there's companies like Techmark Incorporated in Michigan that has a certified lab that run these daily, that their YSI, their membranes are, used on a daily basis, that they're going to give you accurate data, and really help you, dig in to understand the quality of your potatoes so you can make good decisions when you're in these difficult situations. But these are also very good tools that we use to understand the physiological age and chemical maturity of our potatoes in a normal storage environment. And I have that in my talk here as we go down through, using this very same tool to create what we call sugar profiles, to look at senescence sweetening, and also talk about cold-induced sweetening, of your crop, and how we can learn about those things from the chemical signature or the sugar signature that we get.
Hey, Chris, really fast.
Yeah.
YSI and other tests that you've been talking about are clearly the standard for many, but they may be unattainable to some. Do glucose test strips have any and regular specific gravity measurements, which most anyone should be able to do? Do they have a role in this process at all?
Great point. I think the simplest and cheapest one, right? If you're looking at just get a hint at chemical maturity, gravity measurement could help you there, right? So, but not just doing it once, right? You're creating a line, and you at least need 2 observations. You get it, right? Or 3 or 4 to understand where you are at in this maturity or maturity curve. But I'm afraid that in and of itself is not going to really help you understand the presence of glucose, right? And how that might affect your sugar processing quality, say into Frito-Lay, Shears, wherever. The test strips, I don't have a lot of personal experience, Matt. I think Nora Olson and others have published papers on that, and using those glucose test strip meters. But my impression is just the amount of variability in that and the accuracy. I mean, if you're going to do it, you might as well do it and get better detailed data than doing the glucose test strips. So
Yeah, they could actually be misleading.
I think so. Yeah, and it's kind of the same way with pH, right? So yeah, I mean, hey, I'm just interested in my potting soil, and is it really acidic or really basic? And that test strip helped, and thank you, I throw it away. Well, I think that's kind of true with the glucose meter. But if you've got a 40,000 bag bin of potatoes, spend $100 on a YSI test, right? You know what I'm saying? I mean, what's your risk here? So
agreed. Yeah, it's relative to the investment and the possible return. Invest in the standard. For some who are operating at a lower volume, I'm not thinking for anyone in particular. I'm just saying for those that are operating with a lower volume, they may be looking for alternatives, and repeated specific gravity measurements seem to be very accessible and very relatable to other data sets, right?
and if you invite me down and you have your Fry Daddy and your cooking oil set up, probably one of the best ones is just do periodic fry samples yourself, right?
Oh, yeah.
And you don't need to know. I mean, just do your visual evaluation.
Right. Do a chip test. Yeah.
Get yourself a Fry Daddy and oil and have at it, right? So, yeah. But I want to be invited though when you do that, so I can eat some chips. Okay, enough sarcasm. Environmental mitigation tools, right? So I think Matt, you had brought some of these things up, and I think it becomes a strategic plan. Like, when are you going to deliver your potatoes? Or when do you have available nighttime fresh air to cool your potatoes? And then work yourself backwards based on the maturity of your crop when you should plant. And it happens all the time with all our big growers, right? And I think you guys had alluded to it. Like, the weather's nice, we're going to start planting tomorrow. But you're not going to get fresh air to store those potatoes for 180 days. And there's no 180-day potato that you're growing. So you're going to let it sit in the field for 2 months, or you're going to put it in storage and not have any fresh air to put on it. Or so again, planting date is super critical. Think backwards. I try to encourage the industry to think backwards, to think about some of the things Matt brought up, your maturity of that particular variety, when you're having that stress occur. When do you get nighttime fresh air in your environment? In southern Michigan, it's probably October 5th, right? Central Michigan, it might be closer to September 20th, right? But stuff to be mindful of, because you got to get field heat out of those potatoes. Otherwise, you're going to have pathogen problems. Use irrigation during tuber set to reduce stress. Late irrigation to maintain tuber turgidity is super important to reduce bruising, to reduce tuber pulp temperature, and to prevent some soil clotting, right, which can also drive bruising. You know, the whole soil organic matter thing is so important, and just intentional about your farming practices to drive up soil organic matter for water retention, nutrient retention. Ultimately, I think will result in a better crop. And, you know, that's a whole topic in itself to talk about that. Obviously, the impact that has on CEC or it's a crop rotation. I mentioned calcium nitrate potentially. Yeah, just the value of maintaining your photosynthetic machine. To me, it requires the use of fungicides to do that. I'm going to race on here for a few more slides and then I'll stop again. Y'all, I just threw up a fertility plan that I use generally in central Michigan. I'm not recommending this plan to anybody. Test your soils, make wise choices. But you can see, for me, this is the ultimate nitrogen load, phosphorus, potassium, micronutrient recommendations that I have that swirl around in my head for sandy loam soils in central Michigan. Okay. Happy to talk in details. I'm not a soil fertility expert. We have one here, but yeah, let me do one more slide and I'll stop for questions here on that. You know, some other things that we're intentional about, and I have some words here that probably don't make any sense to you. Comden2, MRC2, that refers to some of our fields at one of our research stations. But the point here in this line 1 and 2, I want you to see is the use of compost, right? And if you're able, you know, at least 2 tons per acre, both in the fall prior to potatoes, but ahead of potatoes. But again, this is compost, right? This isn't raw manure. This is compost. Raw manures, if you're using those, you know, a year in advance, definitely a winter before applying those to any field that's going to have potatoes. Use in-row insecticides and fungicides. And a point that I've really seen effective for us is a layered herbicide application. And you can see here the use of linuron and dual, like as a delayed pre. And then before we have in-row or between row closure, before we have between row closure, we apply a second herbicide, Sencor and dual over the top. So those are just some things to think about. I'm happy to take any questions on any of the fertility or some practices there.
Chris, I want to ask, how about pH? Is potato have specific pH range? Oh.
Yeah, and you know, I think you need to have, or I should have had on the slide, right? The how pH affects the availability of different soil nutrients, right? So phosphorus, for one, being influenced. You know, there's this concept of lower pH reduces different forms of streptomyces. But again, you know, there's a balance there, right? So to me, the sweet spot is in that low 6s, 6.5 range for us in our soil types. I think you could probably grow potatoes at lower pH and higher pH, but how does that affect nutrient availability and a number of other things that I'm not sure I can address? Matt probably can better for Ohio soils or Indiana soils. Definitely something that you need to be mindful of and know your CEC, right? That's another important component. Yeah.
And then
Matt, yeah, go ahead.
you mentioned the compost here. It might be a time I ask about how farmers deal with food safety, or is there it's a problem because you mentioned the manure. So is there specific regulations of how you use that?
Yeah, and I can't quote them, or maybe not as familiar with those. I could look those up, but yeah, the GAMPs, please, follow GAMPs. And then I'm sure there are HACCP plans that our industry has for supplying to different processors that requirements need to be met there. So I don't know enough of that to respond intelligently about, but be very mindful about, issues, especially like the human waste, yeah, and the heavy metals and the PFAS and all that. Those are major issues, right? Have municipalities spread, products on particular fields. That's a kiss of death, basically, right? From what I know. So as far as you being able to grow potatoes on that soil and deliver it to large commercial processors.
Yeah. Thanks. Matt and Charlie, I think some folks have to go, but as long as you're okay, Grace, if I want to continue.
I'm happy to stop too, right? I mean, there's just so much here. So
yeah. Okay. So now we'll talk about harvest.
Okay. You want me to keep going? So
Yeah.
all right. Sure. Okay, so at harvest conditions, right? We've talked a little bit about physiological and chemical maturity. So timing of vine desiccation, right? We desiccate or apply a herbicide to our potatoes to create uniform maturation, chemical maturation, physical maturation, and skin set, right? That's just something we do on a large commercial scale. You can imagine a large acre field, and the undulation of the field in different areas are going to potentially senesce or mature at the end of the day at a different rate. So we want to try to create some uniformity to that. I think as a grower, just being mindful of your season being hot or cold or a lot of high nighttime temperatures, how that's going to affect your solids, your specific gravity, because that's ultimately going to affect other issues with black spot bruising and pressure bruising. Soil moisture and temperature at harvest, right? Again, I alluded to earlier, turgidity, tuber temperature going into storage, super important, and how they influence tuber bruising, whether it's cold or hot. And also, you're putting in warm water or cold water in storage, and you've set yourself up for a huge thermal mass, say of 80-degree potatoes. You've got to remove that thermal mass or that heat out of there, out of that mass, and that's going to take energy, right? And so fan time and fresh nighttime air, these are all things you have to think about. So we've talked about environment influencing black spot bruising. There's a mechanical component, and that being your harvest equipment and dialed in and running full capacity, but then educated staff, right? I don't want to just focus on the crop, but boy, if your staff, your harvest operators aren't educated in how bruising can occur, having run like a impact device through your equipment to know where its bruise points are, that you've tried to reduce those impact points, then you haven't done your operation justice, because you just haven't figured out those areas in your operation that maybe are causing you poor quality. Educating the people. Again, the importance of skin set affecting water loss and pathogen invasion prevention. And then, yeah, I mentioned maintaining the harvester capacity. Oh, sorry, just skinning, right? I think we all know skinning. Here's an image of melanin in tubers through the phenol oxidase pathway. You get the melanin formation in the hand of the person holding that tuber. You see those black spot bruises, there, which is not a pressure bruise. This is impact bruise.
So
And
Chris
then,
is that the people who harvest drive the harvesters, if they work more carefully, they can avoid those issues?
well, they're a part of the solution. Harvesting too fast, harvesting too slow, right? There's an optimal volume through that harvesting equipment. So that's one aspect. There's also, have you evaluated your harvester that has old pattern or high drop rates? Okay, but then there's also, as the agronomist that's turning that field loose to be harvested, is your soil super dry? Is it really cloddy? What's your tuber pulp temperature? How turgid are your tubers? So, right, we get criticized all the time. You're irrigating a dead field of potatoes. Well, yes, we are, because there's value in intentionality in doing that. And here are the reasons why. Harvest quality, ultimately.
Got it.
So here's kind of a large scale harvest operation. Excuse me. This is just one example. Two windrowers in the upper left image here. Windrowing 4 rows in 4 rows, putting them into another 4 rows that are undug. From me looking at this, right, you can see, I would say maybe the soil moisture is a little bit on the low side, right? So might encourage the soil moisture to be a little bit higher at harvest time. You can see some clods obviously in this. So you've got the harvester here, pull type harvester in the lower left image, harvesting in the bulk field trucks, picking up the 8 rows that are already dug, plus the 4 rows that it's digging. Field trucks back, you can see the dirt eliminator behind this gentleman in those really small undersized potatoes that are being graded out. And then the large bulk piling of those potatoes in a potato storage. You notice the slots in the concrete in the floor. That's where the air is going to be pushed up through the potatoes, off the top of the potatoes, and then drawn off of the top of the potatoes. So that's just kind of a broad sense of the harvesting operation. We've already talked about nighttime fresh air and how that's important. Measuring and maintaining tuber quality. Those are some metrics you need to collect prior to harvest. I mentioned a little bit about tuber harvest pulp temperature. Below 50 degrees, we see increased bruising because the tubers are too cold. Above 70 really increases that thermal load in the potatoes that you need to get out to cool those potatoes down to improve storability. This idea that typically growers harvest early, say at a cooler pulp temperature, finish later in the day at a warmer pulp temperature. So even within that pile of potatoes now, you have a 20-degree swing in pulp temperature. And if you don't finish that bin in a day, you're going to come back in and start putting cold potatoes on warm potatoes. And then that inevitably gives you the soda can effect, creating free moisture, and then really drives pathogen fecundancy, livelihood, availability, activity, and then really potentially creates some wet breakdown issues for you. So once you finish for the day, your job is not over as a grower. You need to work hard to ventilate that front pile face to get it down to a temperature that's going to be similar to the potatoes you're going to put on it the next day. Again, the importance of removing soil and debris from your pile, because how are you going to transfer air through that potato pile? It's going to be between the crevices and cracks of the potatoes, not of the potatoes themselves, but the spaces, the interspatial area between the potatoes. The more that's clogged up, the more difficult it is going to be to push air through that and to get the crop cooled down and to protect your tuber quality. So ultimately, you need to manage the bottom 3 to 5 feet of your potatoes. You need to create a system to sample those potatoes and understand the tuber quality there. You can see these surface pressure bruises in the image here in the lower left. And this is a result of high fan speed, resulting in poor humidity and then loss of tuber turgidity, and you get that pressure bruising. Well, when you get pressure bruising, you're getting cellular damage, you're getting a release of phenol oxidase, and then the accumulation of melanin, and you'll get a darkening under the skin in some instances. And this image to the right just shows some debris in the pile and some tuber wetness and tuber rot occurring. Moving on to storage management, air quality in processing storages is super important. Managing CO2 levels, depending on what rate you're trying to respire the potatoes at. Maintaining good airflow between 1 and 2 CFMs, and knowing the time when it should be higher and when it should be lower. Good humidity. Remember, we talked about one of the biggest weight losses in potatoes is that weight loss due to dehydration. So the importance of good humidicell pads, good humidity delivery is super important. That'll help drive pressure bruise management. You being able to cool your pile down below 50 degrees reduces pathogens. And then we can talk a little bit about sprout control, but the importance of understanding sugar data, right? Still using the YSI, but you're creating a sugar curve that tells you your sucrose values, which tells you your physiological age of your potatoes, and your glucose ultimately tells you your chip quality. And I'll show some examples of that as we go. You can see it.
Chris, is that here? If the temperature is too low, it actually goes to the sugar side. So
Exactly. And I'll show you an example of that happening in my next couple slides. But yes, cold-induced sweetening is a bad thing, and understanding the genetics of the variety you're dealing with and how cool you are able to hold that. You know, again, you're balancing pathogen development, tuber physiological age, and then cold-induced sweetening, right? There's a number of factors at play here.
Yeah.
So ultimately, ideal storage temperature, right? So 3 phases of storing potatoes: a curing phase, holding phase, and a warming phase. And it's really different for chip, seed, and table stock potatoes. Typically, the wound healing phase, you want to harvest your potatoes, get extreme field heat out, get them cooled down somewhere in the mid to low 50s, 52, 55. You want to wound heal your potatoes as quickly as you can to try to ward off any bacterial fungal pathogen intrusion caused, from bruising. But then holding temperature, right? Chip varieties, typically 46 to 52 degrees. When you talk seed and table potatoes, they can be stored typically much cooler. But again, even with table potatoes cooling at 38 degrees, you're going to get a cold-induced sweetening effect. You might want that trait. You might want your potatoes to taste sweeter to your consumer, or others might not. So that's going to affect that ultimate holding temperature. And then for chips, typically there isn't a warming period other than if you're trying to respire off simple sugars that are causing defects. But for seed, to get that physiological clock moving, to get them to begin to sprout for the grower, you want to warm those up. And then for table stock, you want to prevent bruising, right? Because if you're trying to ship 38-degree potatoes, they're going to bruise much more easily than shipping 50-degree potatoes. So you're going to warm up your bin or a few boxes of potatoes you're going to ship to a more ideal shipping temperature to avoid bruising.
Then, Chris, like the table potatoes is lower storage temperature because of we want the sugar a little bit. Is that also means the storage lifetime is much shorter compared to the chip potatoes with that lower temperatures? Like the duration, how long you can store them?
Well, I think intuitively it would be just the opposite. The colder you're able to store them, it would slow down metabolic processes and then let you store them longer.
Oh, okay. So I guess I confused that. I saw this starch turns to sugar, reduce that storage time, but it's not.
I wouldn't say that at these colder temperatures is necessarily an issue of concern in table potatoes. From my experience, it's really the colder temperatures helping you reduce respiration rate, even though those simple sugars would be more available. At those colder temperatures, you're not going to have the physiological necessity for those simple sugars. So therefore, you're not going to get a higher metabolism rate just because the sugars are present. Higher sugar level presence doesn't necessarily dictate higher metabolism rate. Warmer temperatures will feed the physiological rate of the potato, and then it will require more free simple sugars. So you might be asking questions over my head, but that's my general answer to your question.
Thanks.
So storage management, I want to get in and talk a little bit about cold-induced sweetening, proper ramping temperature. So with potatoes, especially for processing, again, you want to get the field heat out, and you can do that fairly quickly, 0.6 a day, a degree a day. But once you get to like 52 degrees, you really want to slow your pile cooling down. We recommend once you get to 50, really slowing to only 0.2 a day. So someplace around like 52 to 50, you're at 0.4 a day. And so as you get colder, you don't want to shock that metabolism by having abrupt changes. So once you get to 52, you're going to slow your cooling process in degrees per day with cooling. Hopefully that's making sense. Also, there's senescent sweetening, that process of dormancy break that I want to talk about as well. So temperature plays a factor in holding back dormancy, right? In large commercial potatoes, we use sprout inhibitors, right, that disrupt cellular cell division or those metabolic processes in cell division. I'll just leave it at that. So chlorpropam and maleic hydrazide are two products that are used widely. Chlorpropam, CIPC in storage. But then if you do get sprouting, then there's oils, octanol, that are used to can physically burn sprouts. And then, there's some benefits or weaknesses of using ethylene. And then there's a newer product on the market that's been out 15 years or so, dimethyl naphthalene or 1,4-site, that is also used to arrest respiration rate or slow sprout development. So that can be a whole talk in itself, but I have like 4 or 5 more slides. We're almost done. I do want to talk specifically here about cold-induced sweetening. And I'm going to show you, these are sugar curves. And you can see here kind of in the central right, sucrose at percentage times 10, glucose, and then pile temperature. Okay. And we talked about the proper ramping temperature, right, from 56 to 50, at what rate we should do that. And once you get from 50 to 46, that being at a slower rate, only 0.2 a day. From a processor standpoint, keeping in mind the sucrose and glucose thresholds for chip quality. You don't want to exceed 2% sucrose or 0.007% glucose. So those are going to be our critical numbers as we look through these sugar curves. Keep in mind sucrose of a 2 and glucose of 0.007. So we have potatoes here. It's a variety Manistee that we use widely in the Great Lakes Basin for chip processing. And we're storing this variety at 50 degrees. And you can see the sucrose level when the potatoes were brought in was 0.905, glucose was 0.03. And then as we got the field heat out and cooled these down, there was kind of that signature, or we call it a smile, at the beginning, right? Where the potatoes cool down, And then we've got them suberized. They used up any simple sugars, but now we want to begin the cooling process. So then as we cool further from that ideal suberization temperature, we get an increase in sucrose. We see that cold-induced sweetening happening. Now, is that always bad? Not necessarily. It's a typical physiological response. So you can see here, and I boxed it in yellow, that as we've cooled our pile down to our target storage temperature, we get a sucrose bump, right? So then our sucrose increases from 639 to 875, and then we're kind of bouncing around up in the 0.8s, and then eventually that drops back off and settles out, right? But it takes a little bit of time for that to happen. And in the metabolic process, you've got starch being converted to sucrose, sucrose to glucose and fructose, right? And we primarily track glucose as influencing our fry processing quality, and 007 is our benchmark. So we approach 007 after that cooling phase, right? We get up to 005, but we're never out of spec, if you will. So at 50 degrees for Manistee, this variety always stays in spec for chip processing. Now we were pushing up there, right, as we cooled the pile and see this sugar curve, but nothing out of spec, okay? Well, what happens if you take the same variety, these same potatoes, and cool it 2 degrees farther? Well, the amplitude of the sucrose becomes larger, and the period of time that it takes to get this variety to metabolize out that higher level of sucrose becomes lengthened, right? So what it ultimately does then is reduce the marketability of your potatoes, right? Your marketability went from, on the previous slide, really unaffected from, say, January 1 through June, to at 48 degrees, your market window now, because you've got some higher glucose that's affecting your chip quality, you really can't market these well till after maybe March 15th. But maybe that's when your market is for these potatoes. It's April and May. So, hey, I'm going to take advantage of some cooler temperatures, reducing pathogen load, increasing my reducing my physiological respiration rate to push my crop out later. So I don't mind getting a little higher sucrose bump because I'm going to have time to clean it up later to deliver my potatoes. But if I want to deliver this bin of potatoes in March, I'm not going to cool it to 48 degrees based on this set of data. Moving on to one more example, cooling the same variety to 46 degrees, what happens? Well, even a higher amplitude, right? It really pushes me into a wider period of poor chip quality, right? So would I ever store Manistees at 46 degrees? Even if I wanted to ship them in June, I would say no, because you're going to have higher simple sugars that potentially are going to create chip defects for processing plant. So those are 3 examples of cold-induced sweetening. I'm going to end with an example of senescent sweetening. And again, this is just a natural physiological process of those daughter tubers that were produced. We're going to go through this period of dormancy break, and sprouting, right? This naturally occurs, especially at warmer temperatures without sprout inhibitor utilization. And so here's the process playing out. But here's me using this sucrose tool, sucrose monitoring tool, as a measure of when is my crop physiologically aging and when should I market it. Well, here's a variety from Michigan State stored at a fairly warm storage temperature. And here's my sucrose signature, right? And keeping in mind, well, I never get to that value of 2. Okay, but I am seeing someplace here in February a steady increase in sucrose values. So we say when you see 2 or 3 repeated sucrose increases, your crop is beginning to break dormancy in storage, therefore is an indicator that your crop is physiologically aging, and therefore you should market that bin of potatoes soon, within a month's time. So Sucrose increase is always lagged by 2 to 4 weeks of then glucose increase, and then finally respiring off if your potatoes aren't too old to respire that free glucose out of the system. So here you can see the sucrose increasing around March, but then you don't really get into a danger point for some 2 months later, at least that given variety. Now there's other varieties that it happens very quick, where you only have a couple weeks to market your crop. So it's just an understanding of the variety genetics, your storage temperature. But again, utilizing this sugar tool is a way to not only understand cold-induced sweetening, but senescent sweetening, right? So you can see the chip quality pictures here in early February were very good, but then in early May, poor because they were breaking dormancy, conversion of starch to sucrose, then to glucose. Okay. With that, that is the end of my hour and 40-minute talk with you guys. Resource for you, msupotato.medius.re. I do a lot of on-farm variety trialing. You can do variety-specific searches here and understand and look at variety trial performance data from my program through this website. Happy to do a separate webinar on that. I also have resources at collegeofagnaturalresources.msu.edu/potato outreach. And you can check all the different links and buttons out there. So I have a team of 4 individuals that are awesome and they're super supportive, as well as a bunch of industry partners. So thanks for the opportunity to talk to everybody. I hope it was informative. Feel free to reach out to me, LONGCH@msu.edu. Happy to chat. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chris. I do have one last question about your variety trials. Are you evaluate both production phase and the storage and the quality, or the whole entire process of the varieties?
Are you asking me which part I'm
Yeah, I
involved in?
mean, when you do the variety trials, are you evaluate from production to post-harvest the entire thing for different varieties?
Now, we do it all the way through the process. We have a research demonstration storage facility that we store up to a whole semi-load of potatoes that we can then ship into commercial processors. So we're really working to build the whole variety development process pipeline from the breeder through our commercial end user. So we work with all the breeders nationally and some private breeders to our seed industry, our grower industry, and then ultimately our processors are all involved in the work I do in the variety development process.
Thank you. And thank you so much, everyone participate. Thanks, Dennis. Stay at the end. Thanks, Grace, so much for share all those knowledges. I really enjoy learn all those things from you.
You'll have to cut it down into better segments. I apologize for killing everybody. So
No, that's great. Yeah. Thank you, Chris. And I hope you had a great day.